Thanks, Christy. Good afternoon. My name is Kyungman Kim from the Department of Biostatistics and Medical Informatics. And I would like to welcome you all to the fourth meeting of the Clinical Trials Community of Practice on behalf of Professor Nazia Safdar, who will join us later. Next slide. Here are some of the reminders to keep muted and video off and use the chat for comments and questions, and that the session will be recorded. And if you have any IT issues, please contact Brian Dygate. Next slide. With the topic of today's speech presentation, I would like to provide a historical background. The notion of explanatory versus practical trials was developed and published in 1967 Journal of Chronic Disease article by two French physician cum statisticians, Daniel Schwartz and Joseph Lelouch. Next slide. Then they further developed their ideas in a book originally published in 1970 in French and translated into English by a British statistician, M.J.R. Healy, and published in 1980 to make it available to a wider readership. Through the 1967 article and the 1980 book, the notion of pragmatic trials became more widely known, but unfortunately, it took US almost another 30 years to catch on to the idea after the original 1967 article was reprinted in 2009 in the Journal of Chronic Clinical Epidemiology, which was a successor to the original Journal of Chronic Disease. I would like to share a couple of pages from the book in the next two slides to provide a context and to emphasize the importance of statistical methods with me being a statistician, that is. Next slide, please. Professor Healy, in his translator's preface, starts with a statement highlighted in the yellow. A clinical trial is a major undertaking, and any doctor contemplating such a trial is liable to stand in need of considerable guidance on the statistical side. Then he goes on to say that he has undertaken the chore of translating only because he felt that the book contained material of the first importance, which was not available elsewhere, namely the distinction between the explanatory and pragmatic approach to clinical trials, and that the blurring of the distinction lies at the core root of many contemporary difficulties concerning science and technology. Next slide. Here's also a highlight paragraph from the introduction of the book, which states that the development of truly scientific methodology for clinical trials capable of providing them with a degree of rigor, hitherto characteristics of laboratory experiments, is a development mainly of the years since the Second World War II. And some of the early trials conducted by the Medical Research Council in UK comes to my mind. And he states that the essential core of this methodology has been its statistical component. Next. With that said, I'll pass the presentation to Professor Beth Burnside, who will introduce today's speaker, Professor Christopher Lindsell from Vanderbilt University. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Kim. It is, I hope many of you know me. I serve in a leadership role in the Institute for Clinical and Translational Research and as Associate Dean of Team Science and Interdisciplinary Research at SMPH. Just want to start by saying I'm indeed grateful that Nazia Safdar and Betsy Nugent foster this important community of practice as a crucial part of the clinical trials portfolio for which ICTR is deeply supportive. I also want to thank Dr. Kim and Dr. Afshar for added effort in organizing this session, in which we welcome an eminent scholar and implementer of pragmatic trials. Christopher Lindsell is a collaborative biostatistician who's a leader in the application of rigorous biostatistical methods at the intersection between emergency care and public health. He joined the research leadership in the Vanderbilt Institute for Clinical and Translational Research, Victor, what a great name, funded by the Clinical and Translational Science Award, the CTSA. He joined Vanderbilt in 2017. At that time, the following quote summed up his history and trajectory. Quote, Dr. Lindsell is an outstanding leader, collaborator, and mentor who is passionate about improving healthcare through an integration of research and clinical practice. What a great quote. In 2019, Dr. Lindsell was named the co-director of the Health Data Science, or HEDS Center at Vanderbilt. He has contributed significantly to the translational science community as the president of the Association for Clinical and Translational Science. Just finished that tenure for 2020-2021. His current focus is on learning health systems, leveraging clinical processes and data systems to enhance learning from pragmatic trials and observational studies. He has recently published several seminal manuscripts highlighting pragmatic trials and learning health systems in JAMA, Academic Medicine, and the Journal of Clinical and Translational Sciences. I could go on and on. UW in particular owes Dr. Lindsell a huge debt of gratitude for serving with distinction as the chair of the ICTR External Advisory Board. So thank you, Dr. Lindsell. And without further ado, you're on.
Thank you very much indeed for a very, very kind introduction. Please may I confirm that you can hear me and see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you all today. I've titled this talk, Pragmatic Trials, Square Pegs and Round Holes. And the reason for the title is very much because as clinical trialists, we spend a lot of time in the pragmatic space trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole. And during the course of today, I hope to give some examples of how we can actually do that. And as a true statistician, at the very end, I will kind of leave you with an equation as to how you can get a square peg into a round hole. During the course of today, I have a lot of slides, and I can get through them all if you want me to. But I'm also very open along the way. If people have questions or comments, please do stop me and we can begin a conversation around certain issues. I've broken this talk up into several sections. We'll start by talking about why we want to do pragmatic trials. Then we'll step into regulatory, and I'll tell a few stories about the regulatory framing of pragmatic trials that I've been involved in. I'll briefly mention the financial considerations of pragmatic research. This is something that I get a lot of questions about, and it's a complicated question. If we've got time, I'll run through some innovations in EHR embedded trials, and also talk a little bit about acting on the results of pragmatic trials. Again, as we go through the course of the hour together, if you wish to stop and focus on one of these areas, please do. So to begin with, why a pragmatic trial? I mean, traditional RCTs are fantastic to provide really good information about efficacy of a treatment. So why would we want to do a pragmatic trial? Well, our traditional trials are really easy because when we look at the world, we know what we're looking at. In the pragmatic world, when we look at the world, it can be very, very confusing. And a pragmatic trial is really trying to answer a question about what we see in the real world. And that's a much more confusing reality to live in than the efficacy clinical trial. And why would we do this? Well, we heard a little bit of the history of pragmatic trials. I think that the importance of pragmatic trials is also best framed in the context of the evolution of evidence-based medicine. a long time ago, not quite as old as pragmatic trials, but close. Back in 1971, there was a very clear recognition of the long gulf between an RCT finding and implementation in practice. And as many astute authors have written over the years, including some that I have on the screen here, a large part of the discrepancy or the lack of bridge between an RCT, a randomized controlled trial, and clinical practice is because it's unclear to whom the results of the trial apply. In an efficacy trial, we are trying to understand, on average, is there an effect of a therapy? And we control many things to answer that question. In a pragmatic trial, we're answering a somewhat different question. Pragmatic trials are designed to provide information on whether interventions work in practice. And so it is an effectiveness question, not an efficacy question. And that fundamentally changes how we think of the research. Ultimately, a pragmatic trial should use sound scientific methods to generate real-world evidence in a real-world setting. As our traditional trials, our efficacy trials, we really focus on understanding the experimental truth, the reality of whether a drug works in an incredibly well-controlled environment. The pragmatic effectiveness trials are trying to work out the truth of the effectiveness of an intervention in real life. So ultimately, we are changing our focus from maximizing internal validity, potentially at the expense of generalizability, to maximizing external validity. In other words, we are maximizing the relevance of the findings of our study to real life. The goal in my book is to shorten the timeline from producing a result and knowing whether or not something has potential effectiveness to implementation in practice for those things that are demonstrated to be effective. A few thoughts as we kind of think about pragmatic trials, and we go from the why to the what. We want to do them because we need to answer questions about what works in real life. Pragmatic trials are essential to closing the gap between evidence and practice and uptake. They do provide a really good vehicle for novel trial designs and innovations in trial implementation. But I do want to share that pragmatic trials are not the easy choice. I am the fortunate position to be an editor of a journal, and I frequently get sent papers and they say, this was a pragmatic trial. Because it was pragmatic, we only measured the outcome in a third of people. I'm sorry, but a pragmatic trial is not an excuse to do a bad study. A pragmatic trial is a strong evidence base for directly informing practice. To make it a strong evidence base to directly inform practice, we really need to ensure that the trial is designed with validity in mind. It's designed to produce real results that are pragmatic in nature. It's not designed to produce a weak data set that is full of flaws and challenges that observational real-world data have. One of the important aspects of the square peg and round hole analogy is just because someone says it can't be done, doesn't mean it can't be done. And over the course of the next 15 or 20 minutes, I'll go over a couple of areas where we showed that it could be done when people said that it really couldn't, and hopefully provide a few examples of that. There is an important toolkit that is available for people who are designing trials. We've talked about the why, we've briefly mentioned the what, the how. The how is like every trial. Each one is different and requires a lot of thinking to make sure that the question is right, the variables that are being considered are right, the cohort is right, the population at risk is considered correctly, and the measurements fit. In the pragmatic trial space, the toolkit that is fairly useful is called the PRACY2 toolkit. And they have some information sets that are easily available to you to be able to help you think about the design of a trial in the pragmatic space. And the keys in here are choosing why you're doing your trial. If you really want to do an efficacy trial, please do an efficacy trial. Don't do a bad effectiveness trial. So why are you doing your trial? If it is an effectiveness study, then absolutely, let's think about a pragmatic approach. What are the choices that would make it pragmatic? And ultimately, once we've designed the trial, did we achieve the pragmatism we were hoping for, or do we need to revise the design a little bit? The Précis-2 wheel is very helpful to help with this. The Précis-2 wheel has identified 9 domains of practicality. And those 9 domains of practicality are probed with a leading question. And each trialist is encouraged to think about their study on these 9 domains. Eligibility. To what extent are the participants in the trial the same as those who would be eligible for the intervention in usual care? This is a particularly important one. How do we ensure the funnel into our pragmatic trial does not restrict the cohort that is eligible to enroll? Similarly, how do the recruitment processes influence who is in the study, and how do the recruitment processes change both the process of care and potentially the activities of the research? The setting again, how different is the setting of the trial to the usual care setting? How different is the organization of the study to the organization of usual care? How controlled is the delivery of the intervention, and how managed is adherence to the intervention? How strictly is follow-up maintained? Is it the traditional clinical trial, 30 days plus or minus 12 hours? Or do we allow for variable follow-up based upon an individual participant's interaction with the healthcare system? What does the primary outcome look like? Is it a primary outcome that actually matters to participants and to providers? Or is it an esoteric outcome that it was intended to demonstrate efficacy? And ultimately, to what extent does the entire data set contribute to the analysis? And in a pragmatic trial, the intent is that all information that is collected contributes to the information set. The way that Précis-2 helps helps investigators to make design choices is, as I said, it probes on these 9 domains. And using a radar plot like this and plotting the trial with each of those questions, it is possible to determine whether or not your trial has more of a pragmatic flavor or more of an efficacy flavor, and therefore whether your trial is going to answer effectiveness questions or whether you're going to be restricted to the efficacy space. As an example, efficacy or explanatory trials typically have narrow eligibility with fairly restrictive recruitment processes, a rigorous setting and organization with tight control over intervention delivery and tight control over follow-up. And hopefully we are choosing outcomes in all of our trials that are relevant to participants. But here in this radar plot, we see that the area contained is fairly small, and that would point towards more of an explanatory or efficacy trial. That's a little different to a pragmatic trial where we want to open eligibility. There's a little energy to recruit perhaps, but not as much as a comprehensive efficacy study. We may need to overlay a little organization on healthcare to be able to implement the intervention and extract data. But ultimately, a trial that looks like this on the Précis wheel would be considered a pretty pragmatic study. So now I've shown a tool for thinking a little bit about pragmatism. I'd like to briefly comment on the regulatory considerations. In pragmatic trials, we find that the regulatory pathway for the study itself, particularly as it relates to informed consent, is one of the primary drivers of practicality on the domains of recruitment, screening, and enrollment. So the need for consent affects practicality and inclusivity. Consent can be waived or modified if the research poses no more than minimal risk, and it is impracticable to do the research without a modification or a waiver. This is a phrasing of the rules that allow for a waiver or modification of the research consent process. And the question about the minimal risk determination comes up an awful lot. And the precise statement in the regs is the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life. And so the kinds of things that are very, very appropriate for evaluating in pragmatic trials, where the goal is to minimize the recruitment and consenting burden, those things really fall into comparing existing care standards, or comparing things that are known to be safe, or evaluating things that are being implemented anyway, and we just want to understand in a true randomized controlled trial way whether they have the intended effects. I'm going to share some examples of how we've done this in very different ways. We have a trial ongoing right now where one of our case scholars is leading a stepped wedge trial to delabel inpatients who have a penicillin allergy. Using a risk calculator, a very simple algorithm, he's able to identify patients whose penicillin allergy is likely a false allergy label. In the study, he approaches the patients, or the team approaches a patient and offers a penicillin challenge, an amoxicillin oral challenge, to see if the patient would like to challenge their label. Because this is a procedure, it's giving the oral dose, there is the requirement for the informed consent for the oral dose. The research itself is to measure what the proportion of patients who are given this opportunity, who take the opportunity, and who ultimately get their label removed. In this particular setting, it was determined the research itself was the collection of data. The clinical activity of the removing labels had the appropriate consent in place, and the IRB granted a waiver of informed consent for the research components. Slightly differently, we have another study ongoing at this point in time where we're trying to understand the contribution of ketamine as one of the contributors to a multimodal pain control regimen in the perioperative space. In this environment, we realized that the study team was going to be talking to every single participant in the trial to obtain surgical consent. And in this situation, rather than focusing on a waiver of informed consent to minimize the burden to being in the study, here we used a modified procedure where we embedded a research consent into the clinical consent itself. This process was met with a lot of favor and has achieved a high uptake rate. We were asked along the way, if you do this, will people just sign it thinking that it is not, that it's clinical consent? In other words, we were asked, is this true research consent that people will feel they can opt out of? While we have a high uptake rate, we do have people who refuse the research component. And so we're pretty comfortable that when done right, embedding consent into a clinical consent process, embedding research consent into clinical consent, can be truly informed research consent. We have another situation where we had two care standards. It is common in our institution for Pitocin to be administered during the third stage of labor, and it may be administered either before or after the delivery of the placenta. And there are reasons why the timing might be important. The administration before the delivery of the placenta may result in some adverse consequences, whereas administering after the third stage, the delivery of the placenta, may not have the necessary benefits. And so understanding the timing is really an important question. And locally, we found that this was a pretty random thing. There was no systematic practice. So we worked hard to develop a protocol that would compare the administration of Pitocin prior to the placenta and administration of Pitocin afterwards. We requested a waiver of informed consent. Just the conversation around Pitocin can be a challenge for some patients. The idea of being able to obtain informed consent during the third stage of labor was to us a little bit challenging. We were advised that it may be possible to pre-consent all of these participants. However, we made the argument that pre-consent would mean we exclude all emergency deliveries. And those we thought would be those participants that are essential for our data to generalize to. And so we requested a waiver of informed consent. That waiver of informed consent was denied. And so we thought about this a lot, and we were not certain about why, but we decided to go back with another trial type. And this time, instead of a treatment, we just said, what if we compare whether somebody is reclined or upright during that period of time? So the positioning during labor. And we integrated this into our previous ideas and presented it forward. And again, a waiver of informed consent was denied in this setting. So while we have some successes with informed consent and obtaining waivers or alteration of the consent process, we also have some failures. And I believe it is essential for every pragmatic trialist to really understand the rules and the regulations and the local institutional review board culture to ascertain whether or not individual approaches to consent are or are not going to be acceptable. Beyond the IRB, I'll share a story about two trials. We are currently conducting a trial called Pilot. This is a cluster randomized trial of oxygen targets in mechanically ventilated patients. There is some evidence that if you hyperoxygenate patients, it can cause lung injury. If you under-oxygenate patients, it can cause brain injury, and there's everything in between. And so in this particular cluster randomized trial, we are randomizing patients to having an oxygenation target, either a high oxygenation target somewhere over 95%, a moderate target somewhere between 92 and 96-ish, or a low target somewhere between 88 and 92. And in this trial, it's moving forward. It was funded by NHLBI. The DSMB has been reviewing it all along the way, and it's almost ready to read out. At the same time, the exact same study, designed as a multi-center trial called Corolla, went through a process of approvals to be conducted within the PETAL network. The trial design was reviewed by the network, it was reviewed by external ethicists, it was reviewed by IRBs, and all the way through, there were questions, there were concerns, of course, but at each step, people said, okay, we can do this study. It makes sense to do it, and we are not violating participants' rights or welfare in doing it. However, in this particular case, our barrier was not the IRB, it was not the FDA, it was our DSMB. Our DSMB did not support a waiver of informed consent for this trial, and really felt that we should do this as with full consent to give a sense of what the implications of that. When we designed the trial to have informed consent, the budget increased from about $2.5 million to about $30 million. So that's the impact of the consent question. Also in this consent space, I will share that the FDA oversight of a pragmatic trial does change things. So even if a study is no more than minimal risk, the FDA does not permit a modification or a waiver of the informed consent process. However, we have discovered that the FDA can be very, very friendly in helping us find ways to do the research within the confines of the regulations that exist. So we're in the final stages of a trial. This, as a pragmatic trial, really is kind of in the middle. It's not a truly pragmatic trial because it is FDA regulated, but we designed it to be as pragmatic as possible. The study is to compare fentanyl to ketamine plus fentanyl, fentanyl plus ketamine to fentanyl alone for the treatment of long bone fractures in adult patients. This particular trial is being implemented by paramedics in the back of an ambulance. And so we had to come up with some very interesting ways to put our square peg into a round hole. So our study kits, they look like that box on the top right-hand side. To give you a sense of size, that's about the size of an iPad. And it's about 12 inches deep. Those study kits were put on ambulances. The paramedic would discuss a study with a potentially eligible patient. The paramedic is not prevented from doing what they normally would do in taking care of an acute trauma and pain on scene, including treatment, splinting, bandaging, and administration of fentanyl. And that can all occur before the consent process in this particular study. At that point, the consent form or the box is opened up and a consent form is sitting there right at the very top. And the consent form needs to be signed by the participant. This was the one thing we could not get away from with the FDA oversight of this trial. The challenge is the ambulance on the top right there. If you take a long look, this is what it may look like after a traumatic pain. And this is a photograph of one of our informed consent documents. So while getting a signature was done, the use of that informed consent document is questionable. The other thing that I will point out is that this was a patient in the study. Even if minimal risk, even if we weren't requiring FDA oversight, sometimes a signature just is not practicable. And so this particular trial, I think, is our best example of just because somebody says it can't be done, doesn't mean it can't be done. We have now enrolled 200 patients in that trial by paramedics. We have had more protocol deviations than I would like, but as a trial, it is progressing to conclusion. So before I move on from regulatory considerations, does anybody have any questions they would like me to address at this point? Hearing little, I will talk through some of the financial considerations that we have observed in our pragmatic trials. Some people have posited that a pragmatic trial is a cheap trial. Our experience so far is that it is certainly not the case. They just have different expenses. The cost of the investigator time certainly doesn't change. And one might argue that in a pragmatic trial, the investigator cannot go on autopilot the way they might in a randomized control trial. And they need to have their eyes on, because as care changes over time, it threatens the external validity of the trial. And so the investigator must be heavily engaged. The clinical coordination that we typically see in a pragmatic trial is certainly no longer certainly no longer a huge need. And so the research coordination cost is greatly reduced. The IT support goes much, much higher. And so, for example, if we are deploying a study that needs a best practice alert to guide physicians to do a certain thing, I need to have IT help in the medical record environment and potentially outside of the medical record environment to implement or perturb the system. Similarly, I may have considerable expenses on pulling data out of the system if I'm using it to measure outcomes. Enrollment in the study, so this is coordinator effort, PI effort. The time to get a patient into the study in a pragmatic trial, if we're using an approach like a cluster randomized trial with a waiver of consent, those costs, again, are greatly reduced. In a pragmatic trial, I have the costs here as being almost eliminated. And that is because my general approach to pragmatic trials is a comparison of processes of usual care or content of usual care. And so there is no intervention cost. However, there can be intervention cost. Generally, that intervention cost would be restricted to the cost of the drug itself or the intervention deployed in clinical care. And finally, I think pragmatic randomized controlled trials can be much more complicated to analyze than a standard trial. And given the threats to the internal validity, we frequently need to do a lot more sensitivity analysis to ensure that the external validity is acceptable. Beyond the costs to do the trials themselves, and I see the note in the chat box, the difference in costs in the example I gave previously was simply in the enrollment and data collection costs. Those are the personnel costs needed to enroll people into studies. But beyond the cost to do the trial, pragmatic trials do offer the opportunity to go well beyond understanding effectiveness to understanding real-world cost. In our efficacy studies, we may get a sense of what a drug does in a really controlled environment, but we really have no sense of what the true long-term effectiveness for the individual or for the group of individuals who might be treated with a therapy. And so I would propose that pragmatic randomized controlled trials provide a framework where we can move the needle in true cost effectiveness analyses and understand the value implications of the work we do. I'll give a couple of examples too about how a non-cost effectiveness analysis pragmatic trial output can be informative, and how considering costs and resources within the trial can be helpful. We've completed a study. A behavioral intervention team was brought into the system. The idea was that team would review all patient records on certain units to identify patients who are at risk of acting out or having some behavioral concerns that might need managing in the inpatient setting. The idea is that by being proactive and managing these patients actively, we reduce the negative consequences of acting out behavior on our nursing staff. We improve the experience of patients, and we mitigate the use of behavioral control techniques. There was a lot of support for the behavioral intervention team from the system, but it's expensive to bring this in and it's difficult to resource it. And there's also a possibility that if we bring in such a resource, it could actually increase patients' lengths of stay, and it could increase the demands on the care resources to take care of patients. With this particular study, as we looked at the data, we carefully explored how this changed outcomes. Where we found the strongest influence is on the nurses' perceptions of their ability to manage patients. Our interpretation of the data was that in the existence of a behavioral intervention team provided just-in-time training to the nurses, or provided a layer of professional development or backup support that helped them be much more comfortable managing a harder patient. And so the outcome of this is that rather than having a behavioral intervention team on every unit in the hospital, a small investment in a single hub team can accrue the benefits, but minimize the programmatic costs. If we hadn't conducted this as a pragmatic randomized controlled trial, I don't believe the health system would have been able to make a good value decision on the outcome of our data. And I will share one other learning along the way, is that understanding cost information and value data as a part of our pragmatic randomized control trials can be an important way to leverage support from a health system for conducting pragmatic randomized control trials. There was a nice article in the New England Journal of Medicine a couple of years ago by Liora Horvitz in New York. And in their environment, they're not calling it pragmatic trials, but the flavor is a pragmatic trial flavor. They have managed to fund their system, their platform for conducting these pragmatic trials in their healthcare system by demonstrating a return on investment to the healthcare system. So making the value measurements, the cost measurements, alongside the effectiveness measurements in these pragmatic trials can really help to create a funding support for answering real-world questions about real-world therapies.
Chris,
Yes.
Here's a question from Professor John Matsumura. What are the types of expenses that drive costs from, say, 2.3 to 13 million with a need for informed consent? And was it because of the coordinator time or something else?
In this particular situation, if the trial had been deployed as intended, it was a cluster randomized trial where the intervention would be training of the respiratory therapists and the clinical care team with a process by which the unit-based oxygen target would be switched once each month. The effort to deploy that and to collect the subsequent outcome data is really restricted to the core study team and to people pulling data out of the EHR. The transition to the consent requirement, given that the enrollment needed to be at the time or close to the time of mechanical ventilation starting, we would need to have coordinator teams on call 24/7 to be able to respond to a ventilation occurrence, go through a consent process either with a participant or a legally authorized representative, and then subsequently follow that patient for treatment and outcomes. That transition from a simple deployment and simple data collection to having to have a research team available to respond to an acute existence, that changes the costs considerably. In addition, it means that we will be excluding from the cohort hundreds and hundreds of patients who either don't consent or who we were not able to approach in time to get consent. And that extends the trial duration, also increasing costs. And it increases the burden on the participants that are in the study. So overall, you can see how the change from a very pragmatic, simple deployment, simple data collection to real-time consent in an acute environment is huge. And to give you a sense of sample size, this was a 20,000 patient trial. Any other questions on the financial side before moving forward? I'm going to make a few comments about new technology that has been developed that can facilitate the use of the EHR. This is technology that is available. It isn't the only technology, and there are other ways of doing this work. So we know that the electronic health record is a natural tool, both for data collection, but also for manipulating the system. We can use order sets, best practice alerts. We can use many hooks in the system to make changes that are small and that will achieve the intervention we expect it to achieve. But we find that it's difficult to work with the EHR for research. And some of those difficulties are really based around trying to get priority for research within the operational space. And so whether it's extracting data or inserting function, trying to get pragmatic clinical trials into the EHR can be hard. In a standard clinical trial, the idea of collecting data out of the EHR, so going into the EHR, pulling out clinical data, logging into a research system, transferring that data from a research system or into the research system, putting data in a CRF, and kind of making that process simpler has been a big part of what FHIR has fixed, and the dynamic data pools and other electronic data warehouses have really helped to facilitate the extraction of data from the EHR. However, what they haven't done is really looked at this process of identifying a patient, enrolling a patient, treating a patient, and collecting outcomes. And so the REDCap on FHIR and other tools have fixed that first bit of getting data out. Now I'm going to talk briefly about a process to identify, enroll, randomize, treat, and collect patients. This we called Flowerbed. This was run through the Petal network, and so we needed a flower type of analogy. So it's a workflow for EHR embedded clinical trials. The design requirements are that we could identify a cohort in real time, we could get the data flowing in real time, and we could validate the data in real time. Our ecosystem is an Epic ecosystem, but this also works for Cerner, and we use REDCap. Building in Epic a silent BPA of some kind, we can trigger REDCap to listen for potentially eligible patients. And that silent BPA is just like any clinical trial alert or best practice alert. When certain criteria are met, in this case, eligibility criteria for a study, the alert fires, REDCap is notified. REDCap can then do a one-time data pull from Epic using FHIR and ensure the patient is truly eligible. We can bring in data from other places. The research coordinator could go and extract data from genetic testing or from extramural testing, conduct the randomization process, and then we can start streaming the outcome data into our study database. Beyond that, if that study database is local, it's inside an institution's local ecosystem inside their firewall, we can use REDCap's API system to transfer de-identified data out to a central data coordinating system. So this process creates a very pragmatic way of identifying a patient, randomizing a patient, extracting the data from the EHR and putting it into a local data system, and then transferring that data set to a large data coordinating center to be able to manage a multi-center pragmatic study. So what that looks like is a data lake with all kinds of information in it that can be used to make all kinds of interventions. And in fact, we can use the information that we extract on a real-time basis to feed back to study teams to inform them how they are doing. We're actually doing one study now, very similar to the trial that the NHLBI DSMB stopped and that the pilot trial that is about to read out. The trial that we're doing here is a stepped wedge trial of oxygen strategies in trauma patients and burn patients. And we are able to show in real time how patients are doing on their oxygen titration strategies. And so I present Flowerbed as a disruptive example of how you could fully automate a trial and just watch what is happening in the system. Before I just briefly comment on acting on the results, I see a question in the box. A question as to whether or not a pragmatic trial is randomized or not. In general, a pragmatic trial will have a control arm and a test arm, and we want to compare what is happening between them. It can use a very traditional single or individual level randomization where a patient is randomized to one pathway versus another. It can also use cluster randomized, where an entire health system does things one way and a different health system does it another way. or a clinic does it one way and a different clinic does it another way. We could use cluster crossover, where within a clinic you do it one way this month and next month you do it another way. I would argue that without a methodology that allows for a control condition or a comparison condition, a pragmatic trial would essentially be an observational study. And while we can draw a lot of inferences about the benefit of interventions, particularly if we understand causal inference from observational data, it is an observational cohort study as opposed to an interventional trial. And the goal, I think, for many interventional or many pragmatic trials is to conduct a comparison to a control group that has validity to it internally and externally. I hope that answers the question that was asked. My last couple of minutes, I will comment on acting on the results. When I defined pragmatic trials, I said, a trial uses sound scientific methods to generate real-world evidence. Ultimately, a pragmatic trial, if designed right, should have actionable results. Our experience has been that the willingness to start doing something is very different to the willingness to stop doing something. We, for example, did a large pragmatic trial looking at chlorhexidine bathing. I claim nothing to do with this trial. It was before my time, but it's an important one because in this trial, there were about 10,000 patients enrolled, randomized to a chlorhexidine bathing regimen versus a soap and water bathing regimen. And the findings on this trial, when we looked at the output here, show absolutely no benefit to chlorhexidine bathing. And the bathing comes at a cost to the health system of some $1 million a year. So despite a large pragmatic trial showing that chlorhexidine bathing really didn't have any benefit on the primary outcomes of infection rates, our practice hasn't changed, and I don't believe it will ever change, because sometimes, no matter what trial you do, the external constraints are too rigid. And in this case, the external constraints of infection control and hospital guidance on how to manage infections means that we would never be able to act on those results. And we have many similar examples, a post-discharge phone call to reduce readmission rates. Health systems love these, and when we keep showing they don't work, they just want to do more of them or differently. And so I would argue in our pragmatic trials, we should come up with a way to help people act on our results, even when those results do not support the hypothesis. Even on one of our biggest pragmatic trials, this is the SMART and SALTED papers, a randomized controlled trial, cluster crossover, done in our ICUs, over a couple of years, 20,000 patients enrolled. And we found a 1%, just under a 1% difference in mortality on average between giving balanced crystalloids and normal saline. We published those data in early 2018. And you'll notice we saw very little practice change, very little change in how Vanderbilt operated. After a few months, we did modify the way that fluids were ordered, and we saw a bit of a change. And it really wasn't until a year later when we said, we're not doing the right thing. And we went in and we perturbed the ordering system that we were able to act upon our change. If I had been smart, what I would have done is I would have modified this in a randomized way, and I would have been able to determine whether or not the implementation strategy of modifying the ordering system was achieving the effect that I was expecting. If I were, then I would be moving my pragmatic trial from being an effectiveness trial to being an implementation trial. And for those of us who live in the efficacy world, I would like to encourage thinking about effectiveness not as the end point, but as the start point of implementation. So in summary, I believe that PRCTs provide information about effectiveness, and they can inform costs. consent considerations are a really key driver of pragmatism. The cost drivers are different. New technologies are really facilitative, and what we used to not be able to do, we can now do regularly. And no matter how good the science or how strong the evidence, there really are challenges to implementation still. And I promised at the very end, I would show you how to fit a square peg into a round hole. Pick a peg that fits these dimensions. So with that, I'll open up for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Unfortunately, Professor Nasir Safdar couldn't join us today, so I would like to open the session for discussion and questions.
I see a hand up from Jennifer.
Yeah, I'm Jennifer Leroy-Marker from Mayo Clinic. I have a question. Pragmatic trials are becoming more highly visible and, is the new biggest thing now. One of the misperception from non-statisticians is that it doesn't need, it doesn't need a lot of statistical support. And in my mind, it should be the opposite. If anything, we need to have more thorough statistical considerations in the trial. What have your experience been, and what would be your advice, addressing those situations?
I know some of our learning health system team are actually on the call today, and they can tell you from their perspective what they think about this. They are not biostatisticians. I will tell you what I think. As a team, doing all of our learning health system trials, we have about 30 of these on deck at this point in time. We have about 3 or 4 project managers who are able to keep that volume of research moving. I need the same amount of statisticians just to keep afloat. And I think my team, my project management team, would tell you that biostatistics is the rate limiting step. And so I agree with you. This is one of the biggest issues. The complex of data to understand the output from a pragmatic trial is much bigger than the data that for an efficacy trial. Right. And that's because we aren't controlling everything. So we need to measure everything and then try to understand how it influences the effectiveness of our intervention.
Thank you.
This is Hyungman Kim. As a statistician, I'll echo Chris's comments, because randomized controlled trials of the efficacy type, there's a lot of controls. So at the end of the day, I mean, statistical issues are relatively sort of simple, except for the technical issues. But with the pragmatic trials, there's so many things that we do not have a very good control or handle on. Statistical challenge becomes so much more complex. So, and I think that Chris showed in terms of the cost associated with the pragmatic trial, where with the pragmatic trial, the cost goes much more higher in terms of the biostatistical effort. There's another comments from Lin Zhao. The Nobel Prize of Economics today talked about a natural experiment and how to conclude causation from correlation observed in real world versus trials. The pragmatic trials using the similar method. Chris, why don't you take a first crack? I'll also would like some comments about that.
I had hoped that we wouldn't get to this question because it's a hard one. I think that there are many arguments around the ability to draw causal conclusions from observational data, and different specialties and different leaders in the scientific world kind of land on different sides of that argument. I personally believe the balance of evidence is what we need to be making decisions on, and understanding the threats to the ability to draw causal conclusions. And there are some observational data from which causal inference is very, very possible and quite valid. There are others where it's not possible. In the pragmatic trial space, per my prior comments, The intent is really to try and create a control condition so that we aren't having to have the dialogue about whether observational data can lead to causal inference. We've obviated that question by creating the perturbation in the system that is the randomization. That's my partial answer to your question, and I'll pass that back.
Well, from my own personal experience, I mean, having done a lot of clinical trials, even in the very controlled, randomized controlled trials of the efficacy type, you end up with some aspect of the data that you collect being not sort of a randomized because of the nature of the data collection and all that. So there's always this question about how to make a meaningful causal inference from the non-randomized cohort, even within the randomized cohort clinical trials. So that's always a challenging issue. But I don't think the observational study will ever gonna obviate the need for randomized controlled trials. I recently edited a book on titled Handbook on Statistical Method for Randomized Controlled Trials. And in the introduction chapter, I highlighted the fact that despite all these arguments about the real world evidence, the COVID pandemic, if anything, emphasized the importance of randomized controlled trials to draw meaningful causal inferential conclusion. Any other questions? Well, we are past the hour. To respect the other's schedule, and on behalf of the University of Wisconsin ICTR and the leadership of the ICTR, and particularly Nasia Saftar as the director of the Clinical Trials Community of Practice, I would like to thank the speaker, Chris Lindsell, for a wonderful presentation today. And I would like to ask the audience to, with a round of applause in the Zoom manner. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.